Hi everybody, my name is Kent Monkman and I'm a Cree artist, primarily a visual artist, but I also work in other media. And here today is my collaborator of many, many years, Gisele Gordon.
Hi, I'm Gisele Gordon and I'm a settler media artist. I do installation work, films, documentaries, and I've been collaborating with Kent for 30 years now.
And we have made a number of our media projects together. And what we are wanting to talk to you about today is our most recent collaboration, which is still in progress, which is Miss Chief's Memoir. And my alter ego, Miss Chief, is a character that I created many, many years ago in my paintings. And I didn't know when I created the character everything about the character. The character just kind of evolved over time in my paintings. And then probably 3 or 4 years ago, I think probably 4 years ago, I started working on a project called Shame and Prejudice. It might be 5 years ago now. And Shame and Prejudice is a touring exhibition of my paintings and installations that is traveling across the country. I think to 8 or 9 venues. And that project was to really ask the Canadian population to think about the impact of the last 150 years on Indigenous people, the last 150 years of the age of Canada in 2017 was being celebrated. And so I was commissioned to create this project to ask Canadians to think differently about our shared history. And so that project kind of broke into 9 chapters. And through those 9 chapters, I attempted to really tell a story through Miss Chief's voice, through her lens, through her way of seeing the universe. And to tell the story of her people, the Cree people, but also other Indigenous lives that were affected through the colonial project. So the exhibition went up at the University of Toronto Art Museum, and when we were considering how we would write the didactic panels for the exhibition, we decided that it should be in Miss Chief's voice. And since Gisele has collaborated with me in the past as a writer and as a filmmaker, I asked Gisele if she would help me write these 150-word, very concise descriptions for each chapter in Miss Chief's voice. And some of the chapters, to give you an idea, one chapter is on residential schools. One chapter is on the disproportionate incarceration of Indigenous people. Another chapter is on New France. Another chapter was on the Fathers of Confederation, and so on. And so I remember when I asked, I was struggling to do it myself, and then I remember asking Gisele to help me, and she stepped in at the last minute, which is kind of typical of how we work. And Gisele was kind of, asking me why I, gave her so little time. But in a very short period of time, Gisele came up with some beautiful writing that really distilled Miss Chief's voice and encapsulated some very complex themes into these beautiful little chapter paragraphs for each of the different themes. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and then we can get to the memoir.
Sure. Yeah, we've been writing, as Kent mentioned, we've been writing films together for many years. So we're really used to writing together. And this usually we have a bit more back and forth, a little bit more time, but this was such a difficult project to write because partially because the pieces were so short, and also Miss Chief's voice up to that point had been more playful. And this was a topic, there really wasn't a lot of room to be playful with the history of our country and genocide that has been perpetrated against all of the original people here. So it was a really, in some ways, it was probably better that Kent asked me. He was going to do the first draft, but then by the time it got to me, we really had no time at all. So, we looked at the original drafts, and it just wasn't quite right. So sometimes when you have that amount of pressure, it's good because you can't think about it and second guess yourself too much. So what we did was Kent would talk about the paintings and the concepts within them, and then would try to distill those really complex concepts. There's so many layers in each of his paintings, and just channel them through Miss Chief's voice, which is we've developed over the years as she's been featured in our films. And then also just feeling this the stuff that's happened to Kent's family, to our family, to all of the families on the lands that we live on, and just allowing it to flow through. I almost don't feel as though I wrote it. It was more like it just flowed through me, and just taking myself out of the way and just letting everything come out onto the paper. So that was the process we did for Shame and Prejudice, and you can take it from there.
So the exhibition, I think, really touched and moved a lot of people because it was very well attended. And as it moved across the country, there was incredible engagement from Canadians from all walks of life, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, and people who are recent immigrants to the country were learning something. So I realized that I'd kind of touched on a nerve, something that hadn't really been addressed in this specific way. But what was also really important about this project, even though they were just these short little didactics, they were so concisely written and so powerfully written that, you know, they attracted some interest from a book publisher, Penguin Random House. And so I was approached, do you have a book project? And in the back of my mind, and Gisele and I have been talking about this, Miss Chief should have a memoir, because much of her, parts of her life have already been explored through my paintings and some of my other artworks and through the films. But we knew there was a lot of material there to work with. And so it was that perfect opportunity to pitch the memoir as a book project to the publisher. And they went for the idea, were very enthusiastic about it. So it was while Shame and Prejudice was still in its kind of early tour that Gisele and I began this project, which is now about 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago that we began this project. And what you see here is it's kind of like a storyboard mapping out all the different chapters. And I'll let Gisele talk a little bit about our first pass and how we started with this project and how it kind of evolved from there. So we can start maybe with our first weekend that we spent.
Sure. So I'd asked Kent to get images, because we're filmmakers, this is the methodology that made sense for us. Asked him to get images of every piece of work that Miss Chief has been in over the course of the last 15, 17 years of her existence.
Every painting I made, though.
Every painting?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we did have the other paintings without her too. Yeah. That's right. And stills from the films, installations. There were over 300 images, and we put them on the floor in Kent's studio in a huge line that was probably, how long was it?
Probably 100 feet long or something.
Yeah, 100 feet long of story.
Yeah.
So of a rough narrative. And then we started, over several days, we just started thinking through what her life could be like, because Kent has so many ideas that he brings to each painting. Sometimes those ideas are just really embodied on their own in one painting. Sometimes they're story threads, narrative threads that relate to other work. So some pieces really worked well. They made so much sense as a long narrative of her life, and others didn't, even though we wanted to put them in. We just, in the end, took them out. And that editing has continued all the way through. But the first big edit was probably, we took 200 paintings out, 200 images out, all the films, and really concentrated on Kent's paintings, and started really honing down what Miss Chief's life story is as a legendary being. What is her Fable was actually so helpful with this because he told us she needs a creation story. So we had to think about, she's a legendary being, how does she fit into the world of other legendary beings and history? And how we tried to construct the story was really a braid. So one strand was her personal story, Miss Chief's personal story. One strand was Canadian history as it is known to most Canadians. And the other strand was Cree worldview as we understand it from the 4 knowledge keepers that are working with us: Floyd Fable, Belinda Daniels, Keith Goulet, and Gail Maurice. And we only, of course, could understand a fragment of what they do, but just trying to incorporate as much of it as we could to the narrative, and just to see how it could all work together to tell a different story of the history of Canada through Miss Chief's personal life story.
So that first paper edit was the beginning. And as Gisele said, it was that beginning of the editing process. Little did we realize how much more we would be editing and pulling things out. Things that we thought were important soon became irrelevant. The book swelled. It got much bigger than we wanted it to be. And so we had to go through this long process. But even before we got to that process, Gisele would spend hours and hours and hours at my studio. She would come in the afternoon with her laptop to take notes, and we called it downloads. So one painting, one image at a time, she would sit there grilling me, question after question. What is going on in this painting? What are the themes in this painting? What were you trying to say with this painting? And that took months actually just to do the downloads, because one painting, we could spend hours talking about one painting. And so we realized we were really getting into some deep terrain in terms of all the different themes and subjects and things that I've been trying to grapple with in my body of work. And so I would look at my iPad and just zoom in and examine each painting and talk about the different ideas I had about what was going on in the paintings. And Gisele would write notes and notes and notes and notes. And through that process of writing notes, that's what also triggered the research period, the deep research into Canadian history. And so Gisele and our researcher, Sadie McDonald, who's been working with us on this project, would dig deep into all of the history of Canada. And at the same time that was going on, we were trying really hard we really wanted to weave this story, the telling of this story, into Cree worldview. So this is where the knowledge keepers were so valuable to us. So eventually we got a rough draft that we were able to send to the knowledge keepers to get their feedback. So maybe Gisele can talk a little bit about that process of the getting the feedback from them.
Mm-hmm. Floyd had walked us through the site of the battle at Poundmaker, and he had talked to us about the oral history that he's been taught. Keith Goulet had talked about the history that he has learned over his lifetime as being a serious researcher and academic himself. And Belinda and Gail also had so much knowledge of different aspects of Cree and Métis history. So we had already incorporated a lot of what we had learned from them, and then reference materials that they had recommended and that we had found on our own research, trying to use as much firsthand account storytelling from Cree people that was obviously written down by Europeans, so there's that filter through it always, but trying to prioritize that perspective of history and have these different narratives battling for prominence throughout the story, including Miss Chief herself, who has her own version of her own life story. So we got incredible feedback from all 4 of our knowledge keepers, and then started incorporating that feedback, rewriting things, changing. Certain sections are very densely complex and intertwined with different perspectives on how things happened and what that meant. So really trying to unpack, but also not write a definitive history book of Canada. This is really very much Miss Chief's personal life story. So, but perhaps it's more true than all the other histories that at least I learned in school, or when we emigrated to Canada. So her personal life story is at least as true as any textbook, as far as we're concerned.
And I think this has been such an incredible project for understanding the character more, because I didn't have a creation story for this character up until we wrote the memoir. We also didn't know the limitations of her power as a legendary being, someone that could live in the past and kind of be in the present and kind of, time travel in that sense. So part of our problem solving with this project was to really set limits to the character and the attributes of the character. What does she espouse? What are the values? And so we kind of thought a lot about Cree laws and Cree values, wanting to have this character be from a certain perspective, and that helped us answer some of how Miss Chief would respond in certain situations. But I created the character as a flawed character, and so she has qualities, human qualities, that are prone to misstep and to failure, and that's, I think, what makes a trickster character kind of some understandable to human beings, is that they're they are fallible. And one of the other aspects that we struggled with was the shifting in tone, because when we started writing, there was this kind of playful beginning to the story, and Miss Chief has kind of played with European characters in the past. By the time we got to some of these dark chapters of the colonial story, we were really struggling with how to find the balance of humor and play in some very dark chapters. And that has been one of our challenges, and maybe Gisele can speak to that, or maybe some of the other challenges that we've had too, because we're still writing this 2 years later, so it's been a much bigger project than we both thought it was.
Well, I think we're still figuring some of that out. We're still in process. So we're doing probably our 5th revision right now with feedback from our knowledge keepers. And one of the things that was pretty consistent was, more humor, because that's a survival tool. So that was, so it takes a little thinking of how to incorporate humor when you're talking about things that are so unbearably painful. So it's been a challenge, and it's one that's still ongoing, but really appreciate the honesty and the generosity of all of our knowledge keepers in this process.
And so one of the things that we kind of came up with to resolve how Miss Chief kind of exists in chapters like dispossession of land or residential schools was to connect her to my own family, my own relatives. And it was about, when I thought about what their lives, how they were impacted through the dispossession of land, how they were impacted through residential schools, we decided to have Miss Chief interact with my family. And we fictionalized some, but we also based some of those stories on my ancestors. And that was a way to bring Miss Chief into the present by grounding her in my family. So the story is, it's very personal in many ways, how Miss Chief interacts with some of these characters in the present day as well as in the past.
Yeah, and so we should explain, this is our storyboard.
Sure.
that we refined over time. So 4-act structure, the blue lines delineate where the acts break from one another. And some of the paintings down below are paintings that we took out, but we might put back in if we need them or if they work as we change the writing. And just in between, we had historical notes, number of bison, the Indigenous population, and you see just how drastic the drop is after European arrival. The millions of bison and the millions of Indigenous peoples start dropping through disease, through dislocation, through all kinds of forced removal. All of a sudden, you have, when you see the numbers from one section to another dropping like that, it's really horrifying. As a non-Indigenous person, I feel it's quite shocking that this isn't more known and this isn't taught in schools, because our history is incredibly problematic.
So this was one of the things that we realized when we were taking on essentially a telling of history, that we had to grapple with all of this real history, even though we were dealing with the telling of this story through a mythological or legendary being. And it's essential that we ground it in this real history, as much as we are sort of playing with this legendary being. These facts really helped guide us and helped us make our decisions about the different chapters and the things that we had to bring forward, and the different relationships that Miss Chief has with the different historical characters in order to tell that narrative.
And each section is really, so it's grounded and anchored in history, colonial history, anchored in Cree history even more, and then anchored also in Kent's paintings. So the writing voice is really trying to, the way we collaborate is often, I'll be trying to find a writing voice that synthesizes Kent's visual ideas, and then we'll write back and forth and edit back and forth. But it really began as a visual story, and so it's always informed by the paintings.
And what's been really fun about this project too is that some of those, some of the ways we're using these paintings, it wasn't necessarily the way that I originally conceived of them, because I would have made these paintings years ago. And now we found a way for these paintings to find their way into this much larger narrative. And with each one of these paintings, because they're representational paintings that have this narrative element in them, they are stories. It is a form of storytelling. So we've been able to expand on it. So the book will be a very lushly illustrated book with all of these images that you see here, and then the text. So I think it's going to make for a compelling read, and we're looking forward to having this book published.
And we're really grateful to Belinda Daniels, Floyd Favel, Keith Goulet, and Gail Maurice, because without them, this would not be possible.
Yeah, their feedback has been incredible, and we're super excited by how much they've given us and how we've been able to really inform this telling of this story with their perspectives as Cree people.
And it's been amazing to have 4 knowledge keepers, because each one of them has a different perspective and brings different knowledge forward. So even though we only have, I'm speaking for myself, a fragment of insight, it's such a generous gift.
So I think that concludes our presentation. We hope you've enjoyed that, and please keep an eye out for the book when it comes out. It's the title?
Mischiefs Memoirs.
Mischiefs Memoirs, a true and exact account of the history of Turtle Island.
And we wish we could be here in person with you guys on Poundmaker, part of the festival. It's an incredible festival. We thank you for listening, and hopefully we can be back next year in real life with you.
Thank you.